Dave Roberts didn't sleep that night. Not because the loss was unexpected. Losses happen in baseball. Every manager who has ever sat in that chair understands that. The sport is built on failure as much as it is built on success, and the men who last in this profession are the ones who have learned to process defeat without being destroyed by it. But this particular defeat was different. This was not a game that slipped away in the ninth inning. This was not a loss that could be filed under bad luck or an off night from the bullpen. This was something more structural. Something that pointed not at a single bad decision but at a pattern. And patterns, in Dave Roberts' world, demand responses. By the time the sun came up over Los Angeles, the decisions had already been made. To understand what Roberts did in the hours after that defeat, you first need to understand what he saw during the game itself. He saw a lineup that had grown comfortable in the wrong way. Not comfortable in the sense of confidence. Comfortable in the sense of complacency. The kind of comfort that settles into a team when the same names appear in the same positions night after night, when the opposition has had enough time to build a complete file on every tendency, every weakness, every predictable response to pressure. He saw Mookie Betts struggle in a way that was no longer explainable by a single bad night. Betts is one of the finest baseball players of his generation. No one in that organization questions that. But a pattern had emerged in his at-bats that the opposing pitching staffs had clearly identified and were now exploiting with increasing confidence. Roberts had watched it happen across enough games to know that watching it happen one more time was not an option. He saw Dalton rushing, who had been given an opportunity that young catchers rarely receive at this stage of a pennant race, reach the edges of what his experience could carry him through. And he saw something else. Something that had been quietly building for weeks in the back of his mind like a question he hadn't yet allowed himself to answer fully. Roki Sasaki. The conversation about Sasaki had been happening in fragments for longer than anyone in the organization had publicly acknowledged. He had come to the Dodgers carrying the particular weight of enormous expectation, the kind of expectation that a young pitcher from Japan inherits when he arrives in Los Angeles with his specific combination of raw ability and still developing command. As a starter, he had shown everything and hidden nothing. The talent was visible. The ceiling was obvious. But the path between where he was and where he needed to be was longer and less predictable than anyone had wanted to admit. Roberts had been watching the bullpen with equal attention. Watching the late innings. Watching the moments when games that should have been controlled began to loosen at the edges. And in those moments, he had found himself returning to the same thought. What if Sasaki's gifts, that particular combination of velocity and movement that made him difficult to track across a short, explosive appearance, were better suited to the back of a game than the front of one? After the defeat, that thought was no longer theoretical. The Sasaki conversion was announced quietly. Not with the fanfare of a blockbuster trade or the drama of a press conference. It moved through the organization the way significant decisions sometimes do, through the people who needed to know first, then outward in careful concentric circles. Sasaki himself received the news with the composed stillness that had characterized his entire time in Los Angeles. Those who were present described him as someone who had perhaps already considered this possibility. Someone who understood that in baseball, as in most things, the most important skill is not the one you arrived with. It is the one the moment requires. He asked questions. Good ones. The kind that told Roberts he was already thinking about how to prepare rather than how to react. Roberts later said that the conversation with Sasaki was one of the easier ones he had that day. The others were more difficult. Edwin Diaz did not leave quietly. That is not a criticism. It is simply the truth about a man who had given everything he had to the game of baseball for long enough that leaving quietly would have been a form of dishonesty about what the sport had meant to him. The news of his move came through the channels that these things always come through. The formal language of transactions and roster moves, the clinical vocabulary that the business of baseball uses to describe what are, at their core, deeply human moments. But Diaz did not let it stay clinical. Before he left, before the last conversation with teammates, before the bags were packed, before the particular finality of clearing a locker that had held your things for long enough to feel permanent, he stood in front of the people he had worked alongside and said something. He didn't prepare a speech. The people who were there are clear about that. It was not the kind of thing a man sits down the night before and writes out in careful paragraphs. It came from somewhere more immediate than that. He said he was sorry. Not for his performance. Not for specific games or specific pitches or specific moments when the ball had gone somewhere he hadn't intended it to go. He was sorry for the way things had ended. For the feeling that he had not been able to give the team the version of himself that he had wanted to give them. For the distance between what he had hoped to contribute and what the season had allowed him to contribute. The room was quiet when he finished. Several people who were present have described the same thing independently, that the apology landed differently than apologies usually do in that setting. Because it was not defensive. It was not the kind of sorry that is really an explanation wearing a softer name. It was just a man acknowledging, plainly and without armor, that he had wanted to be more for this team than he had managed to be. Diaz walked out of that clubhouse with his head up. That matters. That is the part of the story that the transaction wire cannot capture. The decisions about Betts and Dalton rushing arrived together, which made them feel heavier than either one might have felt alone. Mookie Betts being removed from his position in the batting order is not a small thing. It is not a footnote. It is a statement about where the season stands and what the organization believes is necessary to change the direction it is currently moving in. Roberts understands that better than anyone. He did not make that call lightly. He made it because not making it would have been the easier choice, and in his experience, the easier choice in May very rarely turns out to be the right one in October. Betts received the news the way great players tend to receive difficult news, with the kind of measured response that reflects not indifference but discipline. He has been in this game long enough to understand that the decisions a manager makes in the middle of a difficult stretch are not judgments about a player's overall value. They are adjustments. They are the organization's way of saying, what we have been doing is not working well enough, and we are going to try something different. He said the right things. And the people who know him believe he meant them. Dalton rushing situation carried a different emotional weight. Young players occupy a unique and vulnerable position in these moments. Veterans have the armor of experience. They have been through enough versions of this conversation to know how to absorb it without being defined by it. Young players are still building that armor. Still figuring out who they are under pressure. Still discovering the difference between a setback that ends something and a setback that teaches something. Robert spent more time on that conversation than on any other that day. The people closest to the situation describe him as unusually careful with his words. As someone who was conscious that what he said in that room, and more importantly, how he said it, had the potential to shape the trajectory of a young player's career in ways that went far beyond a single roster decision. He told Rushing that the move was about the team's needs right now, in this moment, in this specific stretch of the season. He told him that the evaluation of his future was not contained in today's decision. He told him that the organization's belief in what he could become had not changed. Whether those words fully landed is something only Dalton Rushing knows. But Roberts said them. And he said them carefully. And that is not nothing. The batting order restructuring that followed these moves was not simply a cosmetic rearrangement. It reflected a deeper recalibration of what Roberts believed the Dodgers needed to look like in order to compete at the level the next 4 months would demand. Every position in a batting order carries its own logic. Its own set of expectations about what kind of at-bat is needed in what kind of moment. Roberts had spent years building lineups that matched the right player to the right expectation at the right time. What the restructuring represented was his honest assessment that the current alignment was no longer doing that effectively enough. New names in new positions. New sequences. New demands placed on players who would now need to perform different functions in the game's architecture than the ones they had grown accustomed to. Change is uncomfortable. In baseball, as in most things, it arrives before the people it affects are fully ready for it. That is, in fact, the only time it ever arrives. By the time Roberts sat in front of the microphone for his press conference, he had already made more significant decisions in a shorter period of time than most managers make across an entire month. A reporter asked him directly, "Are these changes a reaction to last night's loss, or had they been building for longer?" Roberts was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who doesn't have an answer. The quiet of someone who is deciding how honest to be. "Both," he said finally. "The loss accelerated things. But the thinking was already there. When a team isn't moving in the right direction, you can wait for the right moment to make changes, or you can accept that the right moment doesn't always announce itself politely. Sometimes you have to make it." He paused. "We made it." The room absorbed that. There were more questions. There are always more questions. But that answer, compact, undecorated, carrying the full weight of a manager who had spent a sleepless night making the hardest calls of his season so far, said most of what needed to be said. Edwin Diaz arrived at his new organization the following morning. Roki Sasaki began preparing for a role he had never held before. Mookie Betts looked at a lineup card with his name in a different place. Dalton Rushing sat with a decision that was not his to make. And Dave Roberts went back to work. In baseball, that is always what happens next. You go back to work.